So an interesting new feature of Laravel 5.5 is the responsible interface, which at first can sound a little bit confusing. So we're going to look at a few examples as to how we can use this effectively to really importantly clear up our controllers. This is a huge problem usually for lots of people. You end up with a huge controller method and you need a way to kind of separate this out. So we'll start with a really simple example and then we'll dive into some really useful things that we can do with this. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just go ahead and make a controller in here, and this will be a user controller. This is something that we'd probably use to show a list of users, show an individual user. In this case, it doesn't really matter too much. So let's create an index method inside of here, and we'll just return a string in here for now. Let's go and head over to our web roots and we'll create a resource for this. So just underneath here, let's create a resource for our users and we'll hit that user controller. All this will do is, if you're not sure, it will allow us to post, delete, show a particular user or show an index of all of our users. So we just reference the user controller in here without any method. So if we head over to the browser and we go over to /users, we should be able to see that user string. Now, of course, in this case, what we would do is we would go ahead and grab a list of users. So in this case, we would use user and get, or we would use user all, and you'd probably do something else in there, paginate it maybe, and then of course you would return, let's say you were building an API, return just the user collection here. That would be cast to JSON and you would end up with the following, if of course you go ahead and import the namespace, really importantly. So you'll end up with the following. Of course, at the moment, we don't have any users in the database. So why don't we just go ahead and use Tinker to generate a few out using the factory that we already have within Laravel set up. So let's go and use our user here. Let's say generate 100 of these and go ahead and create these. All that's going to do is randomly generate 100 users, which we can now see in here. Now, of course, this is incredibly simple. If you were doing something as simple as this, you wouldn't even need to bother using the responsible interface. Maybe you're using some kind of presenter or transformer. In this case, it's very, very simple. Now, what happens if you wanted to maybe just check if this was an AJAX request and then respond with JSON? But if it wasn't an AJAX request, you wanted to respond with a view that you'd created. I don't find myself doing this too often, but this is a start in looking at how the responsible interface can help us. So let's just take a look at the responsible interface on its own first of all. So inside of the HTTP directory, because it's an HTTP thing, we're actually responding, I would create a responses directory inside of here for a small project. And then inside of here, I'd probably categorize this under subdirectories. But in our case, we're going to say user index response. Really importantly here, we want to determine which, or at least represent which kind of method we're showing. So how does this work then? Well, let's just take a look at building this out and then we will see this in action. So let's go ahead and create this user index response class, and inside of this we want to implement the responsible interface. So we're going to go ahead and implement the responsible interface, and let's go ahead and just pull this in so you can see that this is under here. Now if we open up this responsible interface, notice that the interface requires us to implement one method, which is toResponse, and this will create an HTTP response that represents the object. So if we just go ahead and copy the structure for this, because we need to go ahead and implement this in our response, and let's just go ahead and return, say, user response, so we can see the difference here. Now what we've effectively done is we've broken up whatever we want to respond with, and we can just return a new instance of this user index response. At the moment, this doesn't really seem like it would be that helpful, but let's go ahead and do this anyway and just see what we can do with this. So create a new user index response, pull the namespace in for this, and effectively what you've done is you've transferred what you want to respond with over to this object, and everything in here is nice and clean. So if we go ahead and refresh this, notice that we get user response. So because we're moving this over to a new object, it allows us to separate any potentially complex logic that we have into a new object, which is, of course, one of the benefits of object-oriented programming. We can extract things out to new objects and keep things nice and tidy. But in this case, of course, this is very simple. So let's take a look at an example of that user index response if we have an AJAX request. So first of all, I'm just going to leave this alone and we're going to do this inside of here and see how complex things get. So of course, what we would do is create a users variable. We would use user to maybe grab all of our users. And in here, we would use our request, which we can either use the request helper like this, or we can pull the request into any of the methods that we use in our controller, and we can use that request variable just here. Now we have an AJAX method which will detect if something is an AJAX request, but in this case, if we are making an AJAX request to this particular endpoint, we would want to respond with JSON, so we would go ahead and pass the users in there. Otherwise, what we would do is go ahead and return a view, and maybe we had this in a users directory and we had an index file, and we wanted to pass down the users, so we can compact down that users variable into an array. So let's go ahead and create this view, and then we'll head over to Postman and check out the AJAX request for this. So under users, let's go ahead and create this index.blade.php file. This is going to be very, very simple. So let's go ahead and just do a for each on each of these users. So for each users as user, let's come down and end that for each. And in here, we would probably have some kind of user div with a class of user. And in here, we would output the user name, for example. So let's go ahead and do that. If we head over to the browser, of course, this isn't an AJAX request. So we're just listing through and showing the user's name on each of these lines. Okay, so let's go and make an AJAX request inside of Postman. This is just a REST client. If we send a request through normally, we'll just get the web response, so you can see the markup here. If we head over to headers, we need to work out how we can kind of simulate this. So this is just a kind of side tip if you're trying to simulate an AJAX request within a client like this. So just to go ahead and kind of divert away from this for a minute, if we open up the Laravel request object, so illuminate HTTP request, and we look at that AJAX method, this is calling a method called isXML HTTP request. So this will give us an idea as to what determines an XML request or an AJAX request. So if we look for that method in here, it can't actually be found. This is on the base Symfony request. So if we open up this and we go to isXML HTTP request, it's checking if the X requested with header is XML HTTP request. This will happen normally when you're making an AJAX request, but of course we need to simulate this directly in here. So let's just change this over to the following, just a tip if you want to check that out, and send this over, and you can see that we do in fact get that list of JSON response. So in this case then, what we can do is take this logic and extract that out to our user index response, just to make things a little bit cleaner. Of course, this is still very simple. You probably wouldn't need to extract this out to an object that implements the responsible interface in this case, but if things did get more complicated, you could do that. And we're going to be looking at a more complex example in just a moment. So what we're going to do is copy this, or at least cut this out, and we're going to paste it directly over into here. Notice that we all automatically get the request object in here, so we can actually type in this and then pull the namespace in for this if we want to. And of course we need to make a couple of changes here because we need to pass through the users into this new object. So let's bring back returning a new user index response, and we're going to pass the users into this, and over in here we're going to accept these in, of course, in our constructor. So let's go ahead and create our constructor here, and we can go ahead and assign these. So let's go ahead and accept in users. If you wanted to, you could also type in this as a collection of users. It's entirely up to you what you do. So let's go ahead and pull that in now anyway. So let's go ahead and assign this users to a users property, and we'll go ahead and add that property just up here. Now, of course, for something as simple as this may be overkill, but if things got more complicated, you can see how useful this is. You can pass through as many arguments as you want here, probably keeping it to a minimum of 3 or 2 would be even better. So what we can do now is use the request here to check if this is an AJAX request. We can use our response helper and we can render JSON. Of course, this needs to be this users now, and we can do the same for this as well. We can't compact down a property inside of an object, so we have to use the with method here, passing down users as this users. So effectively what we've done with this slightly more complex logic is break this out into a new object, and we have a nice clean controller. If we head over to the browser and give this a refresh, just check that everything is okay here, And in this case, we get an error because it's not expecting us to type in this. So in actual fact, we can't go ahead and do that. That would be nice if we could, but it doesn't really matter too much in this case. So we have our request through, we do our logic, and we end up with the following. If we head over to Postman and go ahead and resubmit this through, it works in exactly the same way. So essentially what we've done here is just broken this up into a really simple response. That is pretty much all the Responsable interface does. It allows you to create an object, return it from your controller, and whatever's in toResponse will be output to the page. Of course, you can just go ahead and return a view here if you wanted to, but to be honest, if you are returning a view, it's no problem to just go ahead and do this in here. Let's now though look at a more complex example, something that would actually be really useful with the Responsable interface. We'll start with looking at how we can change this user index response over to transform the users that we get out. At the moment, we're just returning all of the data inside of here. And although we can hide things like the ID, the created at, and any other columns from the response, it would be nice if we could make use of a Responsable interface object to go ahead and transform this data. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just get rid of the view here. We're going to assume that we're building an API and this returns a list of users just in here. So even on our browser now, we're just going to see a list of these. So what you would normally do to go ahead and transform data is use something like Fractal, which allows you to define out a kind of transformed version of each of these objects. You may have seen this before, and there's a package just here called Laravel Fractal, which makes this really, really easy to use inside of Laravel. But if you're building a really simple project or you don't want to pull this in, then our new Responsable interface can make this incredibly simple to do. So how do we go ahead and customize each of these objects using this? Well, of course, we could do this in the controller, but the whole point of extracting this out into an object means that we can do this a lot better inside of here. So inside of toResponse, what we'd want to do is perhaps map through each of the users. So because this is a collection, we can go ahead and use the map method on Laravel's collection object. Now for each of these callbacks just in here, we will get this user and we can go ahead and return the data that we want to see inside of here for each user, effectively just transforming this to what we want. So in this case, we can say, well, we only really want the name and maybe we also want the email address in this response. So we can easily do this to effectively create a transformer without anything else. So let's switch this over to users and let's reference the local variable that we've just gone ahead and mapped through, give that a refresh, and we end up with the following. So super simple transformer extracted out to a method just in here. Now it would be even better, since we're inside of an object here, to go ahead and create maybe a transform users method and go ahead and do all of this inside of here. So let's paste this into here and instead go ahead and return this user's map, and then inside of our toResponse method here, we can just call that method. So we could say this transform users like so, and that has nicely cleared that up. So give that a refresh and we get exactly the same results. You can do this with all your data depending on how you're transforming things. It's a lot nicer to use something like Fractal or the Laravel Fractal package, which of course makes use of Fractal, but this is a kind of first step of transforming your data if you want to, and this is massively cleared up using the Responsable interface. Okay, so let's go over and look now at a slightly more complex example. I'm just going to do a bit of setup and then we'll see what we can do with the Responsable interface in a bit more detail. Okay, so I've just created two more tables here and of course created a model alongside of these. This is product and sales. We're going to focus on sales first and look at how we might want to output within some kind of admin index how many sales we'd had in total and also the total revenue that we'd taken as well. So let's say that we had a couple of sales in here. Let's just manually add these in for now, and we'll go ahead and create another one just in here. So of course this is two sales adding up to £15 or whatever currency you're using. So how would we do this then? Well, let's think about the URL structure first. Admin, products, and sales. This should give you an overview of the amount of sales you've had and also the total value. So what we want to do is create a controller for this. So let's create a controller in here and let's call this admin product sales controller. Of course, the structure here doesn't really matter too much for now. So if we head over to this controller then, of course, inside of an index method, we'd want to render out a view which showed all of these sales. So let's return a view just first of all. So let's say admin index. And of course, we want to pass these down as an array, perhaps inside of here or using the with method. It's entirely up to you how you would do that. So we maybe have total sales, and this would be some kind of value. So let's just hard code this in for now. And maybe we also had total revenue again, which, in this case, it'd be 2 and that would be 15. So let's create this view just down inside of here. So let's create an admin folder. Let's create an index.blade.php file. We'll keep this really simple. We'll say total sales, and that will output the total sales. And then we'll just break down and we'll have total revenue in here, like so. And that will, of course, reference the total revenue variable. So in this case, then, if we just go over to resources or routes and web, and we just go ahead and set up a really simple route here. So let's go ahead and say route get admin products sales, and we reference the admin product sales controller, and the index method, we should see them two values in. So of course, what we've done now is not a lot inside of here, but it could be worse. So let's go ahead and say total sales and actually assign this to the sale count. We can see here that we've just got this sale model in here already, and the same with the revenue as well. So we would have total revenue, and this would be the sum of the total column inside of our database. So in here, we can go ahead and reference total sales, quite simple. And down here, we can reference total revenue. So if we just give that a refresh, it looks like we need to pull the sale model in there and also fix up the error just here with that spelling. And there we go. So we have the total sales and the total revenue. Now, in this case, things could get a little bit more complicated. This could be more complicated. You might be using some where clauses in here. We want to extract this out to an object that uses the responsible interface. So let's create a response just in here under here. And of course, I'm just going to put this in the root directory, but you could categorize these. And we're going to call this admin product sales index response. So if I was to create these, I would say, well, use the kind of same structure as my controller with the method, and then I would add a response on the end of this. So let's go ahead and build this out. So a class of admin product sales index response. And of course, we need to implement the responsible interface like so, and go ahead and pull that in. And of course, pull the namespace in for this as well. We need to, of course, if we just head over to here, implement the toResponse method. So let's go ahead and create this inside of here, and we are pretty much done. So what we can start to do now is extract all of this out. So I could pretty much get rid of all of this, paste it inside of here, pull in the model that I needed, and then I could go ahead and just return this. So if we just return a new admin product sales index response, we should get the same result, of course, if we pull the namespace in for this. There we go. So already we've moved things over, but of course what we've just done is moved one thing to another place pretty much for no reason. We could have kept that inside of that method. So the whole point of this is if you do need to start extracting things out to other methods, it's better to do that inside of here than it is to do that inside of here. So what we could do is inside of our controller, create a total sales method, which went and returned that value, but we're cluttering up our controller here with additional methods. We'd rather do that inside of the response object just in here. So what we can do now that we're in a new object or a new class, we can very simply say, well, I want to extract out the logic to calculate the total sales into a new method, and I want to do the same thing for the revenue as well. And now it's out of our controller, because of course we're going to have other methods inside of here like show. We don't really want to clutter this controller with lots of methods that only relate to, say, the index method. So in this case, what we can do is we can take the total sales and we can just simply return this from here like so. And of course in here this might be a little bit more complicated, and we can do the same with the total revenue as well. Go ahead and return that. And of course, we can now clear this response method up, and we can just reference this total sales method like so. And we can do the same thing for the revenue method as well. So this total revenue like so. Okay, we get the exact same result. We've extracted this out, but it hasn't cluttered up our entire controller. Now, just to further demonstrate this, what if we wanted inside of our controller a show method which took in a product and we wanted to show the specific sales and the specific revenue for that product? Well, again, if this logic got a little bit more complicated, or to be honest, even if it didn't and you just wanted to start out very cleanly, you could use a class in here with a responsible interface. So what we're going to do is just create one more of these. So let's just copy the name of this, and then under responses, we're going to create an admin sales show response. And of course, the naming here is completely up to you. And let's just go ahead and grab the structure of this over, although we're going to get rid of the entire thing. So what we want to do is, of course, return a response in here, and we probably want a couple of methods that are going to make our life easier and extract this out. So let's switch over the name of this. Let's just return something from here so we can get all of our routing set up, and that should be pretty much it for now. Over to our controller, what we can now do is return a new admin product sales show response. We can pass through the product that we're dealing with, and everything is nice and tidy. So let's pull the name in for this. Let's go over to our show response here and make sure we accept that product in to the constructor. And of course we can type hint this because we know that we're expecting a product to be passed in here, and we can go ahead and assign this product to product. Pretty straightforward, and go ahead and create the product property up there for that. Okay, so now that we've done this, what we should be able to see, if we just come over to, say, product 1 and then sales, we should see that in there once we've created the route. So if we head over to routes and web and we just duplicate this down, using route model binding with the ID as the default, we'll pass the product just into here, and of course we'll call the show method. So if we just head over and actually create a product inside of here, so let's just say iPhone, go ahead and add in the created and updated at date manually. What we can now do is relate the sale to the product. So I'm just going to modify the structure in here manually, but of course you'd create a migration for this. So let's say product ID just inside of here. This of course is going to be an integer, of course very rough, we're just playing around here. And let's go ahead and add in the product that we're looking for. So of course this product ID of 1 now has 2 sales, one at 10 and one at 5. So just a really rough way to do this. Now, of course, what we also need to do is for a product to be able to calculate the sales, we need that relationship set up as well. So let's create that sales relationship, and let's return that this has many, and it has many products, or sales rather, like so. And let's of course pull the namespace in for this if it's in a different location. So what we should now be able to do is head over to here. We should see this. It's not working quite at the moment because we need to pull this in, but we are now on that route. So if we head over to the controller, pull in the namespace for this, give that a refresh, we of course are expecting a product to be passed in here. So we're a little bit further along now, but of course over in our response, we just need to pull the namespace in for the product so the type hinting works, and we end up with the following. So with all that setup done, what we now want to do is show a view with the total sales. Now, of course, we can use the same view here, so we could use the admin index view. We'll go ahead and use this anyway, but of course you would separate this out into a new view. So in this case then, we want to go ahead and return a view, and we're just going to say admin index, but like I said, that would probably be a different view. And now in here, we want to grab the total sales for this product. So total sales, maybe we call a total sales method like we did before, and we have the same thing for total revenue as well. So we call a total revenue method. What we can now do is outside of our controller, start to extract these out. So total sales would of course be a little bit more complex than before. We would have to return the product that we went ahead and pulled in. We'd have to access the sales relationship and then grab the count of them. And we can do the same thing for the revenue as well. So let's switch this over to total revenue. And of course, we would sum up the total amount that we'd sold for that particular product. So we now see 2 and 15 in exactly the same way. Now we can kind of prove this just by going ahead and getting rid of this particular sale. And of course, we know that that's going to go ahead and just update. Either way, that is pretty much the responsible interface. We've dived into this quite a bit. If you find yourself creating a lot of methods inside of your controllers, you can now extract these out to separate classes, inject what you need in, make sure you implement the responsible interface, and you can return the response just inside of here. So a really nice way in Laravel 5.5 that we now have to clear up our controller methods.